I remember reasoning to myself, I thought, okay, if there is a God and he made me with this brain, then why wouldn't he want me to use it? You know, like how can he ask me to take some blind leap of faith if he's the one that created me and created me with this brain, this mind? Then surely he'd want me to think about this. And something like someone rising from the dead, it just seemed irrational. I'm really thankful. I had some friends my first year in university. They challenged me to read the Bible. I wasn't that interested, but I was up for a challenge. I would cross things out. I would add things. I would write a big BS in the margin wherever I disagreed. And Christians would sort of, why do you have a BS in the margin of your Bible? I said, oh, that verse makes for a great Bible study. That was my starting point. But I kept reading. I took the challenge, and I'm drawn to the person of Jesus, the way that he treated people, the way that he carried himself. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. You know, a woman caught in adultery, you who are without sin, throw the first stone. I mean, who is this guy? You know, the golden rule, do to others as you would have them do to you. Like we take that for granted, like it's some sort of Hallmark card, or that everybody probably always said that, like back into ancient history. Nobody said that until Jesus walked the earth. Do to others as you would have them do to you. So I'm drawn to the person of Jesus, but I'm still thinking that this is irrational. But I continue to read, and eventually I get through the Gospels. I started in the New Testament. I get to the Acts of the Apostles, the history, the record of the early church. And all of a sudden, I start coming across all sorts of words that I never expected to see in the Bible. Reasoned, debated, persuaded, convinced, explained, examined. I see that the word persuaded is the word most used for when someone comes to faith. I read that the Bereans are more noble than the Thessalonians. Why? Not because they just took some blind leap of faith, but because it says they examined the scriptures daily to determine if what they were being told was true. And all of a sudden I had to start saying, this doesn't seem like a God who's asking me to just park my brain at the door. This seems like a God who's asking me to love him, yes, with all my heart and soul and strength, but also with all of my mind. I didn't expect that at all. And I kept reading. Eventually I got to 1 Corinthians 15. And in the first few verses of that chapter, I read Paul's account of all of the people that Jesus had appeared to after he clearly had been killed in bodily form, after he had risen from the dead. And it says all these different people that he appeared to, both friends and enemies over a period of weeks, both individuals and groups. And then at one point it says at one point more than 500 people at once. And then in brackets it says most of whom are still living, as if you don't believe it, go out and ask them yourself. They're still living. And I thought to myself, how am I supposed to explain that? And my initial thought is, well, this is probably like a legendary development. You know, it's probably sort of like the phone game. Like, you know, you say to one person, you know, Peter says, boy, I really wish I could see Jesus again, you know, and they'd say it to them. And by the time he gets there, it's like, Peter saw Jesus again, right? And it changes as you whisper that in each person's ear. I then started to do some research. And I was confronted with the fact that that passage in 1 Corinthians 15 is a very early creed that predates the letter of 1 Corinthians. And even the most skeptical scholars date it to either within months or within a couple of years of Jesus' actual crucifixion, which is incredibly, incredibly early. And 100 years ago, if you asked scholars, you know, what's going on here, people might have told you legendary development over time. Now, no one will tell you that, in part because of this passage and everyone, even the most skeptical scholars, agreeing that no, this is what people really believed from the beginning. There were many people who were walking around utterly convinced that they had spent time with Jesus after he clearly had been killed. And now I'm thinking to myself, how am I supposed to explain that? There's this huge hole in history. I thought about it like this. I thought the history of Christianity, part 1, Jesus has this sizable following. They believe he's the Messiah. They believe that he's going to rise to power, become an earthly king who's going to reign forever. And then he dies. That should have been the end of the movement. And then, very shortly thereafter, you have the history of Christianity, part 3, the eruption of Christianity. People utterly convinced that they're spending time with Jesus after he had been killed. Jewish people who were so firm about the oneness of God are now worshiping this man, Jesus, as God. They were so firm about worshiping only on the Saturday Sabbath. Now they also have the Lord's Day on a Sunday. What accounts? Something happened. What accounts for that change? I mean, we have letters from the time, like Pliny the Younger, Roman governor at the time in what's now northwest Turkey, and he says, I get these Christians before me when they were being persecuted, and I ask them if they believe. They say yes. I warn them of the punishment that awaits, their execution, and then I ask them a second and a third time. And when they refuse to deny him, then I'm forced to kill them. Asked a second and a third time, told them what the punishment was going to be. And all they had to do was deny Jesus in word. All they had to do was say, okay, I don't believe. And then go home to their homes and continue to worship him, even for their lives. They couldn't deny him. That's how utterly convinced they were that this man had risen from the dead. And the question is, if not for the actual resurrection, why? What explains that? I arranged meetings at the time with two Princeton professors in the religion department. They were the top two New Testament professors, and they were non-Christians. And I thought, okay, I'm doing this research. I'm hearing from Christians. I see how the resurrection bridges that gap from the history of Christianity, part 1 to part 3. But surely if I ask people who don't believe in Christianity, they're going to have alternative explanations for me. So I met with each of them. One of them glanced toward a sort of mass hallucination theory without any conviction or explanation. It's a theory that's riddled with problems. It's not given any credibility in the scholarly literature. Hallucinations are subjective experiences. They don't happen to multiple people at once. It's sort of like me asking you what you thought of my dream last night. My dream, the subjective experience. And even if there was a mass hallucination, the evidence in the scriptures, as even just historical text, you have Jesus appearing to individuals and to groups in different regions over a period of weeks. There's just way too much evidence to account for in that way. Then I met with the second professor, and he told me that as a historian, he simply wasn't interested in the question. And there appeared to be this assumption that as soon as we begin to talk about the miraculous, we are, in principle, no longer talking about history. And I've never been able to understand why he thought he could make that assumption at the beginning rather than following the evidence wherever it led. And I learned two very important things from those conversations. The first was that there's a big difference between intelligence and wisdom. You know, showing up as an undergraduate at an elite university, I kind of just thought, these people are smarter than me, so they're going to have better answers to me, in particular to the deepest, most meaningful questions of life. Not true. There's a big difference between intelligence and wisdom. And the second thing was that criticism without alternative is empty. People were very happy to criticize my emerging belief in the resurrection. But when I asked them, okay, if that is not what's filling this gaping historical hole between what should have been the movement-ending death of Jesus and the eruption of the greatest movement of all time, then what explains it? What accounts for it? And there was no alternative to put in its place. And eventually, I had to come to the point where I realized that it was not a lack of evidence that was keeping me from faith. Richard Swinburne, probably the most significant British philosopher of religion of the last 70 years, held the head post at Oxford, published a book in 2003. It's called The Resurrection of God Incarnate. And in that book, he argues that on the available evidence today, the probability of Jesus having literally, physically, bodily risen from the dead, he says, is 97%. Now, he likes to work with probability theory, so he sort of plugs in numbers at each point in the argument. You're not supposed to take the exact number too seriously. That's not what he's saying. But just the fact that someone of his credibility can make that argument, make it in print, have it be published by Oxford University Press, and then ably defend that claim at the top academic conferences around the world, as I've seen him do, it speaks to the fact that the credibility of the claim of the resurrection is very serious. And when I first came to realize that, I was then confronted with the fact of, it doesn't look like it's the evidence that's keeping me from faith. So what is it? And one of the things I realized was that there are certain types of knowledge that you can only understand to a certain extent before you take a relational step forward. You can only understand to a certain extent from a distance. At the moment, I'm teaching a 3-year-old to ride a bike. And like, first there's that part where it's like, okay, this is how the pedals work, and I'm going to explain this to you. But there comes a point where you can't know how to ride a bike without actually moving toward it and taking a risk and getting on that bike and giving it a try. I love what G.K. Chesterton said. He said there are 2 ways to choose a coat to see if a coat fits. He said you can look at the measurements and check the shoulders and the inseam and all the measurements, or you can try it on. And I think both are important, because for me, in my story, I don't think I would have ever tried on the coat of faith in Christ unless the measurements of history and philosophy and science and sociology and all these other disciplines added up. Unless I could like look at it on the rack and say, you know what, that's in the vicinity of my size. But there is nothing that substitutes for actually trying that coat on and knowing that it fits. And for me, what that looked like was when I got to the point where I could say, yes, God has given us clear evidence that points in his direction. I started to pray a prayer. I call it an Agnostics Prayer, where I used to say, God, I don't know if I'm talking to anyone, but if I am, I would really like to know about it. And the first time that I really felt that God met me in that prayer was in my dorm room, my freshman year, 122, Jolene Hall, dropped to my knees, surrendered my life to Christ. I just knew by a gift, just a grace from God, in response to that prayer, I just knew that he was real in a way that went so far beyond any of my research or analysis or calculations. And more recently, just to encourage you about the way that God may be pursuing you, more recently I met a woman who heard me share that part of my story. And I don't usually mention that specific room, 122 Jolene Hall, but I happened to. She came down to the front at the end, and she had tears coming down her face, and she said, did you say 122 Jolene Hall? I said, yes. She was about 15 years older than me. She said, well, more than a decade before you, I lived in 121 Jolene Hall. She said, and I spent my 4 years on campus praying for the salvation of the guys in 122 Jolene Hall. Wow. She said, all these years I thought that God didn't answer my prayer. He literally answered my prayer word for word for the salvation of the guys in 122 Jolene Hall. So 15 years before I'm even in that room praying that Agnostics Prayer and dropping to my knees before Christ, God has a woman next door praying for that very floor that my knees hit. That is the way that he pursues us, not only with our minds, but then ultimately in our hearts.